From the website Visual Capitalists, an article called $63 trillion of world debt in one visualization by Jeff Desjardins on October from 2017. $63 trillion of world debt in one visualization. If you add up all the money that national governments have borrowed, it tallies to a hefty $63 trillion. In an ideal situation, governments are just borrowing this money to cover short-term budget deficits or to finance mission-critical projects. However, around the globe, countries have taken to the idea of running constant deficits as the normal course of business, and too much accumulation of debt is not healthy for countries or the global economy as a whole. The U.S. is a prime example of quote-unquote debt creep. The country hasn't posted an annual budget surplus since 2001, when the federal debt was only $6.9 trillion, which was 54% of GDP. Fast forward to today, and the debt has ballooned to roughly $20 trillion, or 107% of gross domestic product, which is equal to 31.8% of the world's sovereign debt, nominally. The World Debt Leaderboard. In today's infographic, we look at two major measures. One, the share of global debt as a percentage, and two, debt to GDP ratio. Let's look at the top 5 leaders in each category, starting with share of global debt on a nominal basis. Rank number 1, United States. Debt, $19.9 trillion. Percentage of global debt, 31.8%. Debt to GDP ratio, 107.1%. Rank number 2, Japan, $11.8 trillion debt, 18.8% of global debt, and 239.3% of its debt to GDP ratio. Number 3, China, is $5 trillion in debt, 7.9% of global debt, and 44.3% of its debt to GDP. China has the best debt to GDP ratio of all the countries mentioned in this article. Number 4, Italy, $2.5 trillion in debt, 3.9% of global debt, and 132.6% of debt to GDP ratio. Number 5, France, $2.4 trillion in debt, 3.8% of global debt, and 96.3% debt to GDP ratio. Together, just these 5 countries together hold 60% of the world's debt in nominal terms, good for a total of $41.6 trillion. Now here's the top 5 of debt to GDP. Number 1, Japan, $11.8 trillion, 18.8% of global debt, and 239.3 debt to GDP ratio. Number 2, Greece, $353 billion, not into trillion yet, but 0.6% of global debt, but 181.6% of their debt to GDP ratio. Number 3, Lebanon, $75 billion, not even quite a tenth of a trillion, 0.1% of global debt, but 148.7% debt to GDP ratio. Number 4, Italy, $2.5 trillion in debt, 3.9% of global debt, and they're 132.6% debt to GDP ratio. Number 5, Portugal, $267 billion, 0.4% of global debt, and they have a 130.3 debt to GDP ratio. While only Italy and Japan here are considered major economies on a global scale, the high debt levels of countries like Greece or Portugal are also important to monitor. Quote, in the IMF's baseline scenario, Greece's government debt will reach 275% of its GDP by the year 2060, when its financing needs will represent 62% of GDP. This is from a recent IMF report obtained by Bloomberg. Greece, for example, is continuing along a particularly unsustainable path, and external creditors are getting stingier. Most recently, both the IMF and Greece's euro area creditors have demanded for the country to implement a law that automatically introduces austerity measures if a budget surplus of 3.5% of GDP isn't hit. While Greece has dismissed such demands as unacceptable, the country, along with many others around the globe, will have to accept that constant debt accumulation has eventual consequences. I'll include the link for the book, the new infographic book by this website, visualcapitalist.com, and it's called To Get $63 Trillion of World Debt in printed form, the book link. Thank you for coming to Plain Mundane Show. Hope you enjoyed it. Please hit like, subscribe to us, ring the bell for notifications. I'm Alex Aquarius. Ciao.